Welcome to Tea Book Club, a discussion on Toni Morrison's Jazz. This event is presented by the House of Chanel.
Hello, I'm Hanya Yanagihara, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Tea Magazine. Thanks so much for joining us for the latest installment of Tea Book Club, for which we're talking about Toni Morrison's 1992 novel, Jazz. Set during the Harlem Renaissance, it tells the story of a passionate love triangle and shines a light on city life for Black Americans who came north during the Great Migration. Leading tonight's discussion is the poet, essayist, and novelist Morgan Parker. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and please visit tmagazine.com for more information on Morrison and to sign up for future sessions of Tea Book Club.
Good evening and welcome to Tea Book Club. I'm Kate Guadagnino, a Tea contributor, and I'm so pleased to be here for the third installment of the second season of our series. Since August, we've been exploring New York City novels and spending time in more than one of its boroughs. Tonight, we'll visit Harlem via Toni Morrison's Jazz, which was published in 1992 with the acclaimed poet, essayist, and novelist Morgan Parker. She is the author of the young adult novel Who Put This Song On, and several poetry collections, including Magical Negro, which won the 2019 National Book Critics Circle Award. Morgan is also the recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship and the winner of a Pushcart Prize. After her talk, I'll join her for a conversation and ask questions submitted by readers. If you have any additional questions or comments, please share them in the chat. And now I'm honored to introduce Morgan Parker.
The jazz drummer Art Blakey once said that music washes away the dust of everyday life. The quotidian, the obligatory, just the stasis of everyday life. Music, in particular jazz, is ignition. It's kind of the indulgent part of life, makes magic out of everyday misery. But I kind of don't think that Blakey was talking about jazz washing away any kind of grime, making anything shiny and new. I think that he was talking about excavating it, the way that music often, in washing away dust, illuminates what's underneath it. And sometimes that is something that we don't want seen. Sometimes it's raw emotion, whatever is behind closed doors, secret urges, that comes out in music. I think sometimes the dust is loneliness, and music is the companion who validates and understands your blues. Sometimes the dust is the past, and it makes it difficult to see a way forward and to see differently. But what I mean, it sounds really lovely and nice to think about, but I don't think that jazz makes anything shinier and better. I do think that music lets you get a different view and a different kind of clarity. Like our narrator writes about the dialogue between Violet and Alice Manfred, that they speak with a kind of clarity that crazy people demand from the not crazy. And I really love looking at Violet in particular through that lens. The simplicity of just clarity and what that does in a conversation. For Alice, often it is troubling and it's scary to her. And a lot of folks are afraid of what Violet says and does because she acts and speaks without considering, in a way that feels natural and respectful of her impulses and respectful of her emotions in the moment. And I think something about the jazz age that really drew Morrison to it is that permission, that freedom. She talks about how freedom of expression was a major characteristic that she not only wanted to write about, but through and with and as. She really wanted the book to be infused with the same innovation that jazz requires, the same sort of improvisation and rawness that can happen, in particular with live albums. So music may often be the little bit of hope and revelation amid dark and confusing times, but also illuminates its surroundings And in this book, romantic love is actually what washes away. It creates these goggles. Joe said of Dorcas at some point that she both blesses his life and makes him wish he'd never been born. And I think, romantic love in this book is, though it's the focus, is so fickle and it's a distraction, I think, from everyday life. And I'm interested in that kind of washing away, this distracting. And I think a lot of the indulgence of the 20s was experiencing lushness in a time of depression and in a time of scarcity. Just finding ways to indulge and finding ways to adorn oneself, even when things are a little bit gray. In 1934, Harlem Renaissance writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston published an essay called The Characteristics of Negro Expression. And she doesn't specifically mention jazz as one of those characteristics, but I see them all over this book. Some of them that she mentions are asymmetry, drama, folklore, adornment, the juke, and the sensuality of dancing, the closeness of a juke, and creating an environment that is purely for sensuality. And finally, the one that I'm really interested in is the absence of the concept of privacy. In other words, being up in everybody's business. And I think that really, there's something really fun about the way that tracks throughout jazz. It really is an intimate book. And it's also a book that is about intimacy. And it's also a book that is really concerned and focused on interiors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It's the intimacy of the book starts with the very first word. There is a way that just by starting the book with a tooth suck spelled out, creates a kind of intimacy between narrator and reader. The first time I read jazz, I was pretty angry and confused. I did not understand, and I was a high school journalist at the time, so of course I'm looking for the who, what, where, when. Who is this narrator? So she knows, and she knows the husband, so she must live there. But then she's saying this opinion. It was very confusing to me, and I also felt I was surprised at how little music I read in it. But I think, I'm not sure what I was looking for, but, there's no ruminations on Ethel Waters. There's no, there's not a name drop on every page of a jazz musician. There's not even necessarily too much discussion of instruments. So the second time I read jazz, a little different experience. I was a poet by then, so that helped tremendously. It is a poet's novel. It is a book that requires you to go along with it and trust it. So from the very beginning, you're asked to trust this narrator. And I think I overlooked the fact that the first word of the book is a sound itself. There is music, but even when we don't recognize it as such, there's music to, body language, and there's music in that. And I had just never seen spelled out. And it really was a key for me to reading the book entirely, thinking about the music that I hear every day and don't even think of as such. And finding my way into the book was through remembering what I hear, remembering how dialogue sounds when it's coming out of a voice. This is a book that is meant not only to be read, but really consumed and experienced. That's the invitation that the eye, which is not exactly, parked anywhere, it gives us this opportunity to kind of rove throughout the book and throughout the story. So obviously part of what sets up the intimacy of the book itself, the fact that the book in its writing is intimate, begins with that narrator who seems to see and know all, but also assume a lot and also judge in a particular way. Often the narration is internal thoughts. Often it is quotation, but not in dialogue. So there's a way that we're kind of peeking at pieces of the story. And it's not until one consumes the entire book that you understand how all the pieces go together, which in and of itself, that's the poetry. You're being asked to trust and to kind of go along with the story. And of course that's poetry. And of course that's jazz. We don't know where solos are going to go, nor do the artists a lot of the time. And I think that improvisation, Toni Morrison brings it up quite a bit in her foreword to the book, this idea of improvisation and innovation. Again, that overlaps with Zora Neale Hurston's characteristics of Negro expression, as well as the kind of innovation of language. And we see that throughout the book. That's another way that the writing is intimate. It is a little bit of a gift to Black American readers who know what hinkty means and sedity and, understands that it is a beautiful act of care for a man to cut his lady's kitchen. I think there's a lot in this book that is unexplained. And that really is a gift to the reader because there is an insiderness. We're kind of looking in on these folks and we're lucky to. And what's exciting about getting inside of their minds often, going back into their pasts, we're able to understand their motivations in a totally different way. We're with Violet as she realizes that Violet and her are the same. She realizes that she's afraid of herself. We're in that thought process with her, which is a really intimate and scary place to be. We're not being told the story. We're in the making of the story. Interiors are also really, really important. Not just the interior of the mind, but interiors of folks' homes. I think it's really, maybe my favorite part of the book is that Violet is a hairdresser, and specifically that she does hair in home. So it's in her home or it's in someone else's home. She's often visiting, hungover ladies of the night who need their hair done. And she's in people's most vulnerable spaces. Most Black women know that the beauty shop is a moment of vulnerability. Most of us don't let ourselves out of the house with our hair looking crazy, but it is a place where strangers are seeing your hair in such a mess. And it's a place where you overhear people's conversations, and there is such community in that and just existing. I'm not a chatty beauty shop person, but I listen a lot. And there is such a sense of community and tightness and closeness that invites. I think it's really significant to the novel for her. And I think it's a very brilliant move by Morrison to kind of note that focus on the interiority in that way. That's not to mention the fact that Joe also goes door to door and he sells beauty products. So he's also often let into folks' homes. Both of them find themselves at thresholds and doorways often. Violet has multiple interactions that are on her stoop. There is a way that protection is also a theme because there is the desire to protect one's home. And largely because we were ripped away from ours, home is a really important concern to the African American people. And I think this time, post Great Migration, was an opportunity for Black folks to make their own communities. And we see that in the Harlem described in this book. And we see really moments of agency in creating what home and safety looks like for these folks. But with that, of course, becomes the danger of the outside and what can be let into one's homes. And I think that really it's certainly embodied in Alice Manfred, and it's also a concern of Violet's. What moods and feelings might be brought into one's house? What might set her off? Alice is afraid of any kind of sin that could corrupt by coming into her home. And Joe even says at some point, I sell trust. And so there is such a focus on who you can trust, who you can let through that threshold of your door. And I think the way that interacts, even just with the characters' occupations, is really significant and adds a lot to the already kind of claustrophobia of the community. There isn't an outside world in this book, which is also really exciting. It's suffocating, but in the way that it should be. I think a lot about the live jazz album. This year I've gotten really into the live jazz album. And I think it's maybe the way that most albums by jazz groups are maybe meant to be played. There is something where you can almost like see the sweat dripping off the drummer. And there's a way that you can hear their exhaustion even. And you can hear the audience snapping and clapping and ordering drinks, and you can hear glasses clinking and activity. And I think that is the city. That's the music of the city in this book. It's the tight jazz club. It is being able to see both the elation and the exertion of the musicians, and to be shoulder to shoulder with someone that you don't know, but in the context of the music can feel close to, can feel intimate to. Music is not grief, but I do think that there is a way in this book that music mirrors grief, in that it's background, it hovers over, and it does lead to intimacy among these characters. Without mourning and grief, we don't have the kind of intimacy that we end up with in this book at the end. There is a way that letting in that grieving and letting in that ugliness of emotion, that wiping away the dust, really is the thing that allows for intimacy to bloom.
Thanks so much for that, Morgan. When you were talking about interiors, it made me think of that part where the narrator is describing the furniture, the actual layout of Joe and Violet's home, and saying how it's arranged for living, not for looking, not as a magazine story, or as if for a magazine story.
I really love that, and just the idea of creating a space that is meant to be activated and lived among. And what's exciting and interesting about that is that when their home feels lifeless, it's even sharper. The absence is felt, because the furniture isn't being used. There isn't music playing, and there isn't birds chirping. So I do think it's important to know what it usually is in the book, to contrast with the changes that happen between Violet and Joe.
How would you say it fits in with Morrison's other novels? I think it's maybe worth noting that this was her follow-up to Beloved, which won the Pulitzer, but it's such a different kind of book.
Absolutely. And What's interesting to me is I can imagine a writer having just won the Pulitzer and, she's blown up. But instead of presenting a more traditional commercial novel to her, newfound thousands of people audience, she publishes this weird book and pushes herself even further. And that's the special part of Toni Morrison, that she can write something that to many people is a turnoff and is alienating at first. But her language is what keeps us there. And I think, it must have been a gift to her, to be able to step back from the pressures of marketing and, thinking of audience and really just allowing the characters and the author to kind of live in the book rather than focusing it on, okay, well, now that people know, what do they want from me? I think that is something that is really awesome about this book. But she also, mentioned in the foreword that this book came out of a lot of questions that arose in writing Beloved. Specifically, this idea of love as perpetual mourning, mourning with a U. So she says that, Beloved, she was focusing on mother love. And with this book, she wanted to focus on romantic love, which is what led her to the 20s. She said it was romance seemed a fingerprint of the 20s and jazz its engine. So that's kind of how she got to this time period and this energy that's in the book. And she mentions, not only wanting to explore romantic relationships, but specifically what happens to them in grief and in mourning and in loss. How do relationships rearrange themselves? And she also mentions, what kind of stresses are being put on a relationship when folks are migrating, and coming into a new space with a lot more opportunity, a lot more folks, and a lot more temptations.
Well, I think that's a good segue into talking about the city. And for those who don't know, Morrison capitalizes the C in this book throughout. So it really
That's when I quit the first read. I was like, what? Now this is capitalized? Never mind.
I got used to it, I have to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you kind of become acclimated to her world as you go through. But I think that stresses that this is partly just a book about New York and Harlem in particular, but at least with the older generation in this book, it's a Harlem as experienced by Black Americans who have come up from the South as part of the Great Migration. And so I wanted to ask you how Morrison puts those two places in conversation and what this city can give to its residents and also what it can take away from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we touched a little bit on this idea of taking away a sense of comfort and safety. And there is a way that, you come with stars in your eyes, and they're really focused on the promise of something new and the opportunities that await and the freedom to be oneself that the city allows. But there's a way that, you follow yourself, and you don't become a different person just because you're in a different city. So I think, a major part of this book is folks negotiating with their pasts. And it can be tempting, I think, to just try to wipe the slate clean. And I'm interested in the way that Morrison plays out that kind of struggle for folks who are leaving traumatic situations and really hopeful for a moment, but also, haven't worked through that trauma. And so how does it reappear? How does it enter your new life, and how does it step into your new home? I think that is a big part of what kind of invades. It's not just the temptation of the new city, but it's the past itself that kind of won't let go. Um, yeah. What
Yeah,
else did I miss?
the narrator has that line. This isn't it exactly, but it's something about how it was easy to forget that they had ever lived anywhere else. But then the rest of the book goes on to sort of undermine that idea, because
Mm-hmm.
obviously these past traumas are with them in a big way.
Yeah. But there's also, I was looking at a passage where she says, there's a great little description of all the folks who are migrating. And the thing about the Great Migration was that folks are coming from all over, and obviously slavery was, I mean, fucked up and weird, but a weird part of it is that we have all these Africans that are not able to communicate with one another. So folks are being forced to make their own communities on plantations and be totally cut off, from that kind of exchange of culture. But the Great Migration kind of blends all of these different folks who would have been, from different countries and tribes and have different religions, to make their own, version of a community, of a city, of a world. And she mentioned something about how everyone who's coming, they're all coming from different places, but they all kind of, here we go. Yeah, when they spoke, regardless of accent, treated language like the same intricate, malleable toy designed for their play, which is so cool because it's not only that the trauma of their past in bondage follows them, but also the inventions that allowed them to make it through this time. The way of speaking, the play with language, the self-adornment, the caring for another, that these are things that they were able to bring with them. And we see them kind of play out in this community. It's not the New York City that we know now, where folks are kind of in their own worlds. This is one where absence of the concept of privacy, and there is a way that it's like a family unit being built in this city where everyone's kind of agreeing upon a shared ethos, but from each of their different pasts and influences.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think Alice finds so threatening about the city? Her perspective is not the only one. Morrison is always careful to give us various viewpoints, but Alice seems maybe the most scared and also the most likely to equate music with sex and sin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the thing about, that's always the thing about a new music, like rock is like, and jazz was 100% like that. Even just like the notes that were being used, Alice talks about the bass, and it's like, it is like bodily. And that's scary because these are things that we think about as private and, inside behavior. So when you're outside and, moving your hips that way, that's just an abomination. I really like Alice, but I also grew up knowing a lot of like stringent evangelical Christians. So that equation with sin and pleasure is really with me. And that what is threatening about that is so, it's almost like second nature. So I as I was reading Alice, I was like, I understand, you know, and not even really thinking through for this character what it is that she's afraid of. We definitely know it's about protecting Dorcas, you know. From the beginning, she's like really down on herself for being the one to trust Joe and allow him to come into the home. She sees herself as needing to protect and needing to keep pure her niece, and that concept of purity, which, you know, is a false conception, is really what scares her, I think, about the music. The music isn't concerned with purity. The music isn't necessarily even concerned with tradition. It is looking forward. And that, to Alice, is the unknown. And she doesn't know the rules there, you know? I think there's a part where she kind of mentions how comforting, like, I don't know, was it like a vengeful God or something like that, or judgment. That the idea of sin and judgment and consequence is really deeply important to her sense of right and wrong and how to just be in the world. So when that breaks down, seemingly, she really doesn't know what to do with herself. But I also think she's an example of someone who doesn't know how to find her place in this new kind of world. And that scares her a lot. You know, she feels a little bit left out.
Well, I agree that it's religion as a form of self-protection, and self-protection is also a recurring theme. And I think Alice is maybe at times meant to be comic relief, but then you realize that, you know, some of her fears are very valid because,
Yeah.
especially the women in the book are just facing so many different kinds of potential harm and betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's that passage about all the different ways a woman might harm herself, whether with
Mm-hmm.
literal weapons or money or women's groups. Yeah.
Yeah, and that line is repeated in that little section, like all over the world, women are armed, and that just like kind of kept coming up.
Can you speak a bit on the theme of motherlessness and I think they're related. How a number of the characters feel disconnected from themselves and are sort of on this search to feel whole that gets conflated with a search for their past or
Mm-hmm.
their mom in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that is Black America, you know, like that is the African American experience of not knowing your past, past a certain point. I can count back 2 generations. So that's really, it's such a great parable, I guess, for Black America, and a great way to show what the kind of emotional journey that we all go through of, you know, who am I, where am I from, what does it mean that I don't have access to this part of my past, how do I feel that, you know, that really, I think a lot of it is coming to terms that you can't feel that. A lot of, for these characters, the fact that they didn't know their mothers or fathers, it really is something that they have to come to terms with, knowing that they never will. There's a way that these characters are excavating like rumors about themselves and myths, truths versus, you know, what kind of got passed down. And that is a way of trying to like find some kind of solidness to your identity when there kind of isn't one, or one hasn't been allowed to grow. And I think that that's a really big part of these characters' journeys also, is that, you know, they're like later in life discovering that they're allowed to have their own identities in a way, that is something that the city can give them that maybe was harder back at home, but it's also something that can't be fulfilled in the exact way that that they want. And that state of motherlessness, I think we see in this book carries over to these like adult relationships. And then there, of course, is Violet, and the fact that she says Joe didn't want no babies, so all those miscarriages were more inconvenience than loss. And I mean, going back to what women, were expected and expected to do back then, was she gave so many sacrifices, for her relationship with Joe, which is a big part, I think, of why she felt so betrayed. And of course, it isn't lost on her that Dorcas would have been about the age of the first child that she miscarried. And there's a way that Violet doesn't talk about that with Joe, but that's weighs heavy on her. And I think it expresses itself as hatred and anger towards Dorcas, but really, the fact that Joe doesn't realize or acknowledge that, I think, is like a really big knife to her, because it's not only motherlessness, it is not being able to mother, not being able to care for. And I think, with Violet, she loses the person that she wants to care for, and that is like really derailing for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the loss of a child for her, in the way that it's maybe a loss of a Oedipal mother figure,
an adult
for Joe.
Man baby. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, and Joe, like, I mean, Joe sees everyone as his mother,
right.
Like there is a way that everyone is kind of using each other. Actually, there's a moment where, is it Violet that says this or Joe? Oh, Joe says this about Violet. From the very beginning, I was a substitute and so was she. So they kind of know that even in their relationship, they're each a replacement for something that's missing.
Well, there's a lot of tragedy in the book, even apart from fragmented families. And a lot of it is located in the past and is part of the legacy of slavery. But the ending of the book is actually somewhat optimistic. So I wanted to ask what you think Morrison presents as the various paths to healing in the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of struggle with the ending because of that note that seemed to come out of nowhere, I guess, or like I wasn't sure if I needed it or earned it, or but I also think that it's a way of returning to the central story, of returning to that intimacy, before the narrator kind of makes this confession of how I want to be involved in that. I want that touch. I want that intimacy. There's a little section about grown folks whispering to each other under the covers. And that is such like a delicate and intimate image. But it's also not the first thing you think about when you think about like intimacy between between a couple. So I think by focusing on that everydayness, those small moments of intimacy, she really is, as part of the project of the book, rethinking what love and intimate love is. What is tenderness? The fact that it's almost desexualized, and it's really, the focus really is comfort and closeness.
Yeah, there's a line maybe halfway through where Alice says, if you have something to love, you hold on to it. And it's this idea that despite it all, everyone is still craving love, including the narrator, which I think is such an interesting turn and maybe is saying something about the power and pitfalls of storytelling. That if, there's a trap in being too much of an observer and not actually living.
Absolutely. I think there's so much in this book that's like Ars Poetica. There's a few different sections where it's like, that's just an author's note, which is so cool because, Morrison is allowing herself to become a character in a sly way. And she's allowing herself to, find out things about herself in the writing of the book, which I think, is really felt. And it's another way that the writing in and of itself feels intimate. We get glimpses of the author behind the narrator. And I don't know anyone who could do that so well other than Toni Morrison.
Yeah, she's pretty good. I have a few reader questions. This one is from Kathy Hampton of Georgia, who asked, how has your view of jazz changed over the years? Does it read differently to you now than it did upon your first read? You touched on that, but I'd love to hear more, especially since you are a poet.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what changed was my ability to read without having to know all the information. So with each read, I let go a little bit more. There's a way that when you enter a novel, you're trying to like, okay, where am I? Who are the characters? Okay, I get a sense of the world. And this book resists that for a little bit. Whereas, with a poem, it takes a few lines to tell you where you are and who's there. And, and we're more used to that. So I think that really did help me to just know that I could enter a book and in spite of my like wanting to know everything, just like slow down and let the meaning come. That was the main part. But I also, have spent a lot more time listening to jazz. And I think that has opened up my concept of what jazz music stands for in the context of this book and how jazz is a player. This is not necessarily like a Langston Hughes poem that's like talking about jazz musicians. And it's not even like Corregidora, which Toni Morrison edited, which is very much like about backstage, like we get the blues singers. And this book isn't focused on that. I mean, this is a hairdresser, that's not glamorous. But I think there is a spaciness to modern jazz that invites imagination. And I think Toni Morrison was able to grasp onto that part of jazz, the imagination part.
Dan Chilati of Massachusetts asked, is there a sentence or paragraph you return to time and again?
Yeah, I mean, the first one, always.
Paragraph.
I do have my tattoo of the first word.
Oh, I love it. So, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And it was interesting when I got that tattoo because I had to like explain, what it was. Like White Guy Tattoo Artist was like, what is that? And I went with another author, Black woman, Joy Priest, and we were both kind of like, we were like explaining it to him, giving him examples. But I think so much about that because I think it's such a brilliant move and it's so, it's unexpected and it's a musical and bodily. So I think a lot about that opening, just like as an offering. I think a lot about the line Alice says to Violet. She says, we women, you and me. And there's like something so easy and simple about that. That it's almost like we have nothing else in common, but both of us are women, and I love just that as showing how these characters find common ground, and also showing sisterhood and how how women depend on one another to protect one another. Part of their relationship is discussing how much danger is around, discussing violence and when they feel like being violent. I think a lot about that part. And she also says in that piece, you don't have to, what does she say? She says, oh, nobody's asking you to take it. I'm saying make it. I love that and that really does that felt like such a sweet offering, even in the kind of like curt, hoarse Alice Manfred way, where she's kind of like, I'm not saying you have to do this, but it really is, a beautiful moment of offering, like, this is your life, you're allowed to just make it what you need to. And I think it's something that, looking also at the history of suicide and Violet's family and how that's kind of like in the back of her mind, it's such a beautiful moment of just telling another woman to hang in there, and that she has agency.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a nice note to end on. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our talk.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight for Tea Book Club, and a special thanks to Morgan for sharing her brilliant insights. You can find her essay on jazz at tmagazine.com. If you'd like to continue the conversation, follow us on Twitter at @tmagazine and use the hashtag #TeaBookClub. The next title in the series is Specimen Days by Michael Cunningham. You can RSVP to the virtual event, which will take place on December 8th, on our website. We look forward to seeing you then.